The gate had been closed for 3 years. Now it stood open, and 11 neighbors stood outside it saying nothing. Beneath the fence, 40 acres that should have been dust in a summer this dry were instead lined with lone wooden racks, stacked with pale shells of fungus pushing up through damp brown sawdust. Somewhere behind them, cattle stood fed. Somewhere behind them, the well hadn't run dry. Roy Pruitt, the man who had spent 20 years dumping his sawmill's waste over that fence as a nuisance, stood at the front of the group and said nothing at all. But to understand what they were seeing, you have to go back 4 years, to the day Walter Combs did something everyone in the county said was a mistake. So many men are told what they have is worthless for so long, they start to believe it. Walter almost did. Subscribe for more true stories like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Walter Combs was 52 years old, and the 60 acres outside Tifton, Georgia had been his father's before they were his. $4,100 in unpaid property tax was his inheritance along with the land. His daughter, Ellie Combs, 24, had come home after finishing a degree in mycology nobody in town understood the use of. She'd say things about fungal networks and lignin breakdown, and the men at the feed store would nod politely and change the subject. A.G. was the one who first said it, standing by the fence one spring morning. Waste is just a resource nobody's used yet. Nobody paid it any attention. Not yet. Roy Pruitt's sawmill sat 2 properties over, and for 2 decades his trucks had dumped spent sawdust along Walter's fence line rather than pay to haul it off. Allie noticed the piles weren't rotting flat, they were breaking down from the inside, riddled with a fine white webbing. She recognized it as mycelium, the vegetative structure of wood-decaying fungi. She explained to her father that certain species, particularly oyster mushrooms, digest the cellulose and lignin in hardwood sawdust and convert it into edible, protein-rich fruiting bodies, a method first developed commercially in Japan in the early 20th century and adapted by small American growers in the 1980s. Walter didn't announce it to anyone. He simply built his first 3 growing racks that August, using spent sawdust that had been sitting for free the entire time. Part 3, The Mockery. Roy came by that October, saw the racks, and shook his head. "You're farming trash, Walter," Roy said. "It grows something," Walter answered. "Won't feed a family," Roy said, and left it there. The name spread through town within a month. People started calling the place the Sawdust Farm, said with a smile that wasn't quite unkind, but wasn't quite kind either. Walter kept working. He didn't argue with anyone about it. By December, the first flush of oyster mushrooms broke through the sawdust in dense gray-brown clusters. Walter harvested 19 pounds that week and sold them quietly to a restaurant buyer in Valdosta for $6 a pound. He told no one in town. He just kept building racks, 11 of them by February, and kept the receipt folded in his shirt pocket like it was something private. The drought came in March and didn't let go until August. Walter's remaining tobacco acreage failed outright, and the bank sent a letter giving him 90 days before foreclosure on the $1,100 still owed from his father's debt. The well dropped 14 feet. One of the growing shed's ventilation fans burned out in July, and Walter spent 3 sleepless nights hand-misting the racks to keep the fungal blocks from drying past the point of fruiting. A rumor went around town that he was already selling the land. Walter stood in the shed one night, looking at racks that weren't fruiting the way they should, and doubted, for the first time, whether any of it had been worth the trouble. "It's still alive under there," Allie told him. "Fungus doesn't quit that easy." The mushrooms held. Through 14 weeks with less than 1 inch of rain, the growing operation kept producing 12 to 18 pounds a week, because the sawdust substrate held moisture the open fields never could. And the fungus needed almost none of the irrigation his tobacco had. Roy showed up unannounced one night in September, carrying a replacement fan motor he'd pulled from his own mill equipment. "Heard yours burned out," Roy said. "Brought you one that works." "Didn't ask you to," Walter said. "Didn't say you did," Roy answered, and installed it himself before he left. Walter thanked him once, blandly, and went back to work. By November, 3 neighbors who'd laughed at the nickname started asking Ellie questions at the feed store about substrate ratios and moisture levels. One brought over a notebook, asking her to write down the exact steps. A conversation that used to be about the price of diesel became, some mornings, a conversation about fungal strains and which hardwood sawdust worked best. Nobody called it a joke anymore. What looked like 20 years of waste piled against a fence turned out to be the one thing that outlasted the drought everything else couldn't survive. It's easy to decide something is worthless simply because nobody has taken the time to understand what it actually is. A.G. had said it once, almost in passing, back when nobody was listening, waste is just a resource nobody's used yet. 4 years later, standing at that open gate, it finally meant something. If this reminded you that the thing you've been told is worthless might just be misunderstood, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more stories about people who were right before anyone else believed them.